Hi, this is Alex, and if you love music, well, you've come to the right place because we're all about albums. An album is intended to be played from start to finish in the sequence that the songs were written as were recorded by the artist and the engineer. The artist has a reason for sequencing the songs the way they did. It usually carries a message or an emotional impact, or it is contrasting songs against each other, one after the other. Therefore, by skipping tracks, as can be easily done using a remote control with a CD player, or just streaming specific songs, or even having a playlist set up, does take away from the integrity of the album. Just wanting to listen to the hit song or your favorite song, again, does a disservice to your listening experience and is shortchanging the artist as well as the recording engineer. In the early days, such as the 1960s and 70s, the hit song was typically the first song on the album, and many people bought the album just for that one specific song. So after playing that song, that was it. They never listened to the rest of the album. And again, they are shortchanging themselves because there's a lot of great music within the album if they would just go on and play the second song and third song and so on. They would probably come to appreciate the artist a lot more. Today, albums are more sophisticated with better recording techniques, production, and presentation. If you remember from previous videos, my definition of an album is a collection of songs or thoughts by an artist or a band that is presented to you at one particular time. Therefore, albums are meant to be played from start to finish. We do not like to start on the first song and jump to the third songs or repeat the first song because it's your favorite song on the album. Much like a book, when you read a book, you don't read the first chapter and then jump to the 10th chapter and then you say, you know what, I like that first chapter a lot, so I'll read it again and skip around. That's not what reading is all about. Much the same way, an album, you want to start at the beginning and go through chronologically to its conclusion. This is what the artist and engineer intended, and therefore that's what you should do. So what are categories of albums that are meant to be played in its entirety from start to finish? I will give you several examples, a few in each category. The first category is pretty obvious. It's classical albums. Why is that obvious? Typically, the composer has multiple movements that are being performed around a central theme. Therefore, you would be shortchanging what the composer was trying to actually present to you. A typical example of this would be a Beethoven symphony, such as his famous Fifth or Ninth Symphonies. However, what would be an album more current that would be under this sort of classical presentation? Well, one album comes to mind to me, which is again a great album to play from start to finish, and that is the album entitled The Six Wives of Henry VIII, which was performed and written by Rick Wakeman. What Rick Wakeman did, much like a composer of the era of Beethoven, he composed a piece in 6 separate movements. Each movement was his interpretation of what the life was of each of the wives of Henry VIII. Interestingly, in the original recording, Rick Wakeman actually had a theme for Henry VIII himself. However, due to the length of the album, this was cut out from the album as we know it today. This album was released in the early 70s and did quite well, selling approximately 14 million copies worldwide. The album did get critical acclaim and did gain notoriety over the years after its introduction. The second category is the concept album. Now, the concept album in previous times would be both ballets as well as operas. Typically, this centers around a single or a few primary characters in the story, and then they tell what happens to their lives in that particular time. These can be seen, such as the opera of Carmen or the ballet of the well-known Nutcracker Suite by Tchaikovsky. So what are current albums that would be considered a concept album? Well, this would include, first of all, the great rock opera Tommy. Now, Tommy was written by The Who in the late 1960s, mainly by Pete Townsend. The rock opera deals with a boy named Tommy who is, at the beginning, found to be deaf, dumb, and blind, and it explains to you why he became this way and also shows his growth and the resolution of his illness. Most websites would place Tommy as, if not the best, one of the best rock operas ever written. Also in this category is Pink Floyd's classic album, The Wall, which came out in 1979. This story talks about a rock star named Pink, and he imposes upon himself a isolation by figuratively building a wall around him. And finally, in this category would be the great David Bowie's album, The Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars, more commonly known as just Ziggy Stardust. This is the fifth studio album for David Bowie. It did quite well from him and is still very popular today. This story focuses on a rock star named Ziggy Stardust, and he is sent to Earth to help the Earthlings deal with impending apocalypse. An alternative to the concept album would be the more recent album, American Idiot, written by Green Day. This album also has been turned into a Broadway musical and has shown quite great success. The next category deals with the singer-songwriters. Now, this became more popular in the late 50s and early 60s, as can be seen with the folk movement. This then became very popular throughout pop music, including the Beatles. Now, the Beatles were influenced by the writings of Bob Dylan, and you can see the growth in the Beatles in writing storytelling in their album Rubber Soul. And Rubber Soul is considered the transition album for the Beatles, which went from more simple love songs to more complex introspective songs. The first album I'd like to talk about in this category is the great Van Morrison, his album Moondance. Now, all of you probably know Moondance. If you don't, shame on you. This is one of the great albums of all time. It is in my top 20 list of all time. This album has sold 30 million albums worldwide. This is a fusion album that fuses components of R&B with rock as well as elements of folk music from the Irish tradition. The next album is one that is more recent, written by Bruce Springsteen. This is his great album, Western Stars. Now, this album has a flair of what the West was all about. You can hear it in the musical composition. Bruce wanted to have a more timeless album that deals with the feelings of the American West. The album was inspired by the sounds of Glenn Campbell and the writing of Burt Bacharach. For those of you who don't know, Western Stars was not only an album, it was also released as a video with a soundtrack. I would recommend getting the soundtrack. I think it's fantastic. I think it is far and away better than the standard studio album. This album features Bruce Springsteen and his band performing live along with a live orchestra. There is also, you can probably find it maybe on Netflix, a 1-hour special where Bruce, he performs this live album, and you'll hear it in all its glory. I believe there's probably even surround sound editions for this for those of you out there who like that type of sound. And finally, a singer-songwriter that people don't seem to talk about much these days, but was one of the great singer-songwriters from the 1970s, and that is Cat Stevens. One of his early albums was Teaser and the Firecat. Now, this album contains fantastic songs. Most of you, even though you may not know this album, know the songs. People even hum these songs. They've been on commercials. These are fantastic songs, and I highly recommend this album if you don't have it already. Also, this album did reach number 3 in the charts, both in the US and the UK. So as you can see, it was relatively popular when it came out. The next category deals with albums that were written after a traumatic event or by the artist as a catharsis. The first album is fairly obvious. It is the album Blue by Joni Mitchell, one of the great singer-songwriters of all time. This album came out in 1971. Joni Mitchell is definitely one of my top 20 artists of all time. Everything she does is fabulous, and she really is great with lyrics and has a beautiful singing voice. Now, Blue is a cathartic album in that she had just broken up with her boyfriend, Graham Nash. Yes, Graham Nash from Crosby, Stills, Nash, as well as having an intense relationship with James Taylor. Obviously, this album deals with relationships. Also, another album that deals with relationships is another 1971 album, is Tapestry, the great Carole King wrote. And this is a 4-time Grammy award-winning album. In 1972, it won Album of the Year, it won Song of the Year, it won Record of the Year, and it also won Best Pop Performance by a Female Artist. And finally, an alternative to the category of traumatic event catharsis is the album Dark Side of the Moon by Pink Floyd. Again, one of my top 20 albums of all time. As you know from previous videos, this album has been on the Billboard charts longer than any other album of all time. And as I said previously, you won't even guess it was on the charts for 18 years. This album was conceived due to events related to the hardships the band was going through, as well as discussing mental illness. One of their bandmates, an original founding member of Pink Floyd, was Syd Barrett, and in 1968 the band forced him out due to mental illness, which they deal with on this album. The final category are just albums that have great songs from start to finish. Albums that after you hear the first song, you want to hear the second song, and so on. To me, the first one that comes to mind in this category is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band by the Beatles. This was released in 1967. One of the greatest albums of all time, for sure. This album, after you hear the opening cut of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, it goes right into With a Little Help from My Friends, and then you're excited to hear what's after that. Each song builds until you finally get to the final climactic song, A Day in the Life. This category, however, can be any great album that you like, so just sort of fill in the blank and put in your album in there for greatest album. Also for me, one of the great albums of all time is Hall & Oates' Abandoned Luncheonette. As most of you know from previous videos, it's one of my favorite, if not maybe my favorite album of all time. I kid you not, I love this album. All the albums we spoke about today, I would include in the list of albums to listen to in their entirety. Although I think all albums should be listened to in their entirety, these albums especially deserve that recognition. If there are other albums that you think are great albums that should be played in their entirety, please let me know in the comments section below. If I haven't heard these albums, I surely will take them and give them a whirl. And now for last week's unknown albums. These were extremely easy. I'd be shocked if you didn't get both of these. The first unknown album is one we spoke about already in the video, and that is Carole King's Tapestry. Again, came out in 1971, won multiple Grammys, sold 14 million copies when it first came out, and it held the record at the time for the most albums sold by a female singer. So where does Tapestry rank on the Rolling Stone 500 Greatest Albums of All Time? Well, in the most recent update in September of 2020, this was number 25 on the list, and deservedly so. Again, one of the greatest albums ever recorded. The second unknown album, again, it was a giveaway. This album is Fleetwood Mac's album, Fleetwood Mac. This album came out in 1975. Now, this album did reach number 1 on the charts. However, it took more than a year to reach that height. Now, why is that? Well, the band was touring quite heavily for a year to promote this album, and the album started gaining traction and was starting to be played on the FM radio. This album spawned 3 top 20 hits, including Over My Head, Rhiannon, and Say You Love Me. Now, where does this album rank on the Rolling Stone 500 Greatest Album of All Time? Well, it reached number 187. So pretty high up there, but not as high, of course, as the Carole King album. And now for this week's unknown albums, I'm going to make them a little bit more difficult because last week's were way too easy. So here we go. The first unknown album. Okay, hope you got that one. And now the second unknown album. All right, great. As always, if you know the answer to these unknown albums, please let me know in the comment section below, and I'll let you know if you're right. As always, this is Alex with All About Albums. Thanks for listening. Have a great day, and remember, keep them spinning.